everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Heartland Franchise Guy, your insider's guide to all things franchising in the local area. I'm Blake Martin, local small business franchise owner and your Heartland Franchise Guy. This is the place for advocacy, resources, and education on all things franchising, and a great place for local entrepreneurs looking to learn more about the franchising industry. And today, what we're going to learn about is the legal aspects of franchising. I want to thank our guest, Dave Hohman, who is a franchise law specialist with Fitzgerald Shore Law. Thanks for being here today.
Absolutely, Blake. Thanks for having me. I've been looking forward to it. Should be fun.
Well, I got a lot of notes, and I can see you do too, because there's lots of angles we can take on this. So we're going to jump right into it.
So many issues to touch on.
There is, isn't there?
Yeah.
So the focus today, back to our audience, we're going to talk about considerations and the legal aspects of making the right decisions before, during, and after investing in a franchise business. Dave, my first question is, it's a niche, right? Franchise law is a niche. How did you fall into this niche, or how did you get into this niche when you entered the law practice?
I've been practicing law about 30 years. During that time, entirely focused on business law, a little bit of real estate work.
Okay.
In the last 10 years or so, our firm has represented a number of franchisors, people that are in business that have franchised their concept, and we've assisted them with preparing their franchise disclosure document, the FDD, their franchise agreement, all of their documents, and helping them get the franchise up and running. Through that process, we've learned the state and federal regulations that relate to franchises, and just kind of learned about the process. So with that experience, it was a natural fit that we would also represent franchisees.
Yeah.
So through contacts in the industry, such as yourself, we get introductions to people that are looking to purchase franchises, and we like to work with those people and help them out.
Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So you spend a lot of your time working with folks that are thinking about starting a franchise.
Exactly.
Yeah.
As you know, people, when they're considering a franchise opportunity, they look at different concepts. They're entrepreneurial at heart. They're business people, and a lot of times they want to look for new and interesting new careers. So it gives them an opportunity to pursue a franchise. So we enjoy working with those folks.
Sounds very familiar. Can you talk a little bit about what your role specifically is as you're advising folks on making decisions in franchising?
I think three main areas that we tend to focus on in helping prospective franchisees. The first is with the franchise agreement itself, which is a lengthy document, a lot of information in there.
It's just a short 150 pages or more.
I was going to say some of them are over 100 pages. A lot of them are 40 or 50 pages, and they're very detailed and a lot of contractual information in there. And it's difficult for the layperson to get through that without some input from an attorney. So we try to help them identify the important provisions and evaluate the risks in that agreement. A couple other things we do, we help franchisees when they're ready to purchase the franchise, form an entity, a business entity. Most of the time it's an LLC. Help them get a employer ID number, tax ID number. Both of those things they need to open a bank account for the business, which is obviously
kind of an important step.
Exactly. And then a third thing we do, a lot of times a franchisee will need to either lease or purchase real property to locate their business. So we'll assist them with reviewing lease agreements or financing documents and things like that. So those are three main areas. We're a full service law firm, so we also do commercial litigation, we do estate planning, and so those other specialties can come into play at certain times. But
right,
those are
literally helping people through the life of their career,
business.
their entrepreneurial business.
Exactly.
Yeah. We're definitely going to go back to your comment about lease negotiation in a minute here, but on the topic of negotiation, you knew I was going to ask this question. You hear all the time out there, right? Well, you can't negotiate a franchise agreement, so why have an attorney review it for you? What's your answer to that?
It's a good point. Most franchisors expect a prospective franchisee to sign the version of the franchise agreement that they're presented with. And the reason for that is franchisors have a number of franchises over a large geographic area, and they have to have consistent terms. They can't negotiate special sweetheart deals with one franchise and not expect that to carry over.
Right.
So they're pretty insistent that you maintain their version of the agreement. But really what our role is, as I mentioned, is to help the prospective franchise purchaser get through a really dense document, understand what the terms are, understand the important provisions and how they impact them, and then evaluate the risks of that. So that's really what our role is. There are occasionally some terms that can be nuanced or massaged with a franchisor, but generally they will not negotiate the primary, franchise fee, territory rights. Those things are pretty much set in stone.
Yeah, there has to be equity across the entire franchise system,
Absolutely.
as you say.
Yes.
Yep. When should somebody come to a franchise attorney like you?
As you know, the process of evaluating different franchise opportunities can be time-consuming and can span over many months. Typically we don't have franchisees come to us at the beginning of that process. They need the time to do their research, do their due diligence, determine which franchise opportunities are best suited to them. Toward the end of that process, the franchisor will provide them with the FDD, which I mentioned, which includes the franchise agreement.
The franchise disclosure document,
Exactly.
FDD.
And that has a ton of valuable information, really important for the franchisee to review that, along with that franchise agreement. And by law, under federal law, the franchisor has to provide that to a franchisee at least 14 days before any documents are signed. So usually a couple weeks during that time frame, during that 14-day time frame, is when we'll get contacted and begin reviewing the agreement. Hopefully it's before the franchisee does their on-site visit, their discovery day.
Yeah. It
can be really helpful to kind of understand the contract requirements before you do the in-person visit. So that's kind of the time frame when we like to meet with the client.
And that way, if there's observations or questions that remain, you're arming them with those before they go sit down eyeball to eyeball, break bread with the key executives of the organization.
That's exactly it. Yep. We want them to have eyes wide open when they go for that in-person meeting, so they're armed with questions and things that they've discovered in the agreement that they want to ask about and get responses to. So it's a really good time for them to get those things answered.
Got it. Thanks for the clarity. So you've got a unique perspective. You were talking about, you practiced business law for a number of years and then moved into the specialty of franchise law. So my question with that perspective is, knowing what you know now, why should somebody, so if I'm looking to invest in another franchise and I want to have the agreement reviewed, why does it matter whether I come to you with specific knowledge in franchise law versus just somebody who understands contract law?
As with so many things, the area of franchise law has become very specialized. I mean, there's a myriad of state regulations. There's an entire overlay of federal regulation related to franchise laws. So there's a lot of details involved in that. And only by being familiar with those laws and having reviewed dozens of different franchise agreements and franchise documents do you kind of get a feel for, what are the typical provisions? What are areas that kind of seem unusual? What are areas of particular risk in a particular franchise? So I think that background and experience is something that is value that we provide. And, there's a lot of lawyers out there that are probably qualified to do that, but we pride ourselves on providing that extra customer service.
Gotcha. And if I remember correctly from conversations, I mean, you guys have immersed yourselves in the franchise world as a firm, right? I mean,
we have, yeah. We've, as I mentioned, we've got a number of clients that are franchisors themselves, and so there's a lot of technical work related to that. There's annual updates to franchise documents. We're in the season right now where there's state filings that need to be made. So that background is very helpful when we're dealing with individual franchisees.
Yeah. I get it. You mentioned in your answer there, the different time stamps or time periods. Let's go back to that real quick. So what are the things that you help people with? And I wanted to kind of break it down to the before, during, and after.
Yep.
So like the pre-opening, right? Before somebody starts a franchise, the initial commitments that are typically included in a franchise agreement for somebody that's never looked at one before.
Right.
Could we start there and then kind of go into the covenants and commitments that are during and then end of term ones?
Yep. Yeah, that's a good way to break it down because there's a lot of information there. But those initial requirements, some of the key provisions in the franchise agreement that relate to those sort of things is the actual grant of the franchise license. So the franchisor has a business model, has trademarks, has proprietary information that they use to run their business. So when you sign that franchise agreement, the franchisor is licensing that confidential proprietary information to the franchisee, kind of giving them the leg up to learn the business and become successful at it. So that grant of the franchise is a key provision right at the beginning of the franchise agreement where they license those rights to the franchisee. Another key term is the length of the franchise agreement. These are lengthy contracts. A lot of them are 10 years, some are 20. And that's important because that length of time allows a franchisee a sufficient period of time to monetize their initial investment and make money to justify that franchise purchase. But it's also important because for that entire period of time, that 10-year term, say, the franchisee is obligated to adhere to all the provisions of the franchise agreement, pay all the fees.
Right.
It can be very difficult to terminate that agreement early. So it's important to recognize the obligation that you're getting into.
Thanks.
A couple of the other important initial terms are the training that's provided. The franchisor typically has a training program. They allow one or more of the employees or the purchaser of the franchise to attend that training. So it's important to understand what's involved in that, what information is conveyed, who pays for that is another term that's usually identified in the contract. Territory rights. A lot of franchises provide some level of geographic exclusivity to a franchise.
Right.
So that you're the only franchise that they're going to sell in a particular area. So it's important to understand the parameters of that. How many franchises are going to be around you? What exclusive rights do you have? Do you have any right of first refusal to acquire those territories that are near your territory? That's a very important one. Another one that we identify for people is whether or not the franchise agreement requires a personal guarantee. Most franchisees sign their franchise agreement through an LLC or a corporation as a limitation of liability. But most franchisors require personal guarantees by the owners of the franchise, guaranteeing all of the obligations in the contract, so that if unfortunately the business does not do well, that the personal guarantee requires that the owner make good on those obligations. So that's a very important obligation and something that people need to be aware of.
Yeah. What kind of obligations?
Particularly the financial obligations. So, every franchise agreement has an initial franchise fee that gets paid, which is a substantial investment, but ongoing fees, typically referred to as royalty fees, which is based on a percentage of the monthly income that gets paid directly to the franchisor. So throughout the life of the franchise, those obligations will be necessary to satisfy. And so an individual owner needs to be aware of that and accept that risk.
Got it. Which kind of brought us into the during, right? I said, let's break this down into, pre-opening obligations. You're already talking into during the term. Other things that you're keeping your eyeballs closely on with any of your clients who are, who have invested in or are wondering about what's it going to look like once I've invested in the business?
Yeah. I mean, it's important that the franchisor provide ongoing support during the term of the franchise, so that if there's questions, if there's issues arise, that they've got the experience to provide that franchisee with that additional input so that the business can be successful. And the good franchise businesses have that support and are right there at your side to take care of you and to make sure that you're successful. So those are components in the franchise agreement that we look for. what are those levels of support? There's, as I mentioned, there's ongoing fees that get paid. There's royalty fees. There's typically an advertising fund that a franchisor will have on a national or regional basis that each franchise contributes to. So how does that fund get administered? What sort of advertising will be placed in your area that benefits you directly? I mean, those are key things for a franchisee to understand. Another big one are the restrictive covenants. Every franchise concept wants to protect their niche of the business.
Mm-hmm. Their secret sauce.
Exactly. So every franchise agreement will have confidentiality provisions that say, we're going to provide you with confidential information, including an operating manual and business systems, but you have to keep those things confidential. And both during the term, the 10 or 20-year term of the agreement, and after the term, the agreement will restrict the franchisee from engaging in a competitive business. Yeah. And so it's very important to understand that. If at the end of a term a franchisee wants to transition out of the franchise, they may be restricted for a period of time, typically 2 to 5 years, from engaging in a similar business as they were in their franchise within a geographic area around where their location was. So it's important to be aware of that.
Yes. Yeah. And which is a good thing to know. If you're investing in a franchise, you want to know that your neighbors are held to that, right? Other franchisees who they can't just leave the system and compete against you.
Yep. It's key. I mean, you're right, Blake. It protects both the franchisor and it protects their business, but it protects the individual franchisees and gives them confidence that there's not going to be unfair competition out there. Yeah. So it's a mutually beneficial thing.
Yeah. You got to protect the brand.
Exactly.
It benefits everybody.
Exactly.
But it means you got to really understand what your obligations are.
That secret sauce is what pays the bills. And that's what franchisors, that's what they bring to the table. They've figured out a way to do business in a particular way that's been successful. And so they're giving you that information in connection with your franchise.
Indeed. Anything else, moving to that third category, kind of the post-term, right? So termination rights, et cetera. Yep. Anything that you'd want to highlight there that's particularly important that you see in all, or should be in all franchise agreements?
I think a couple of things. I mean, it's important to understand if the franchisee has any rights to transfer their franchise during the term or sell the franchise. Mm-hmm. Typically, there's restrictions on the ability to do that. Sometimes the franchisor themselves will have a right of first refusal. If a franchisee wants to sell their franchise, the franchisor may say, hey, we have the first right to buy that from you.
Right.
And if they don't exercise that, the franchisor will want to interview a prospective transferee who might be purchasing the franchise, make sure they're a suitable owner, make sure they have the financial wherewithal, and there's typically a transfer fee involved. But that can be a bit of a complicated process, so that's something to definitely look at in advance.
In your experience, if I could interject, does that transfer clause also apply if it's a generational wealth situation where somebody wants to transfer to a family member, a daughter, a son, a niece?
Typically, there's exceptions for that kind of transfer within the family. If it's a through a family member down to a son or a daughter or a related party, typically those are easier transfers to put in place. And sometimes the franchisor will even waive or lessen the transfer fee for those situations. If the franchise has been successful, they definitely want to keep it going, and so they'll accommodate those sort of transfers typically.
Gotcha. If you're a good performer,
exactly,
there's a good chance that transfer is going to go smoother.
I think that's right.
All right.
Termination provisions are important to understand. Most franchise agreements offer limited termination rights to the franchisee, mm-hmm. except for things like breach by the franchisor. If the franchisor doesn't follow through on the commitments that they've made in the agreement, that might be a valid reason to terminate a franchise agreement by a franchisee. But most other termination rights are limited. So you're going to be on the hook for the full 10 years. On the other hand, the franchisor typically does have termination rights. If a franchisee is not performing, if they're not paying franchise fees on time, if they're not following system procedures, if they're not updating, a lot of franchise concepts have a requirement to update stores or update restaurants and keep things fresh. And if a franchisee is not doing that, those can be reasons that a franchisor can terminate the agreement.
What about unforeseen circumstances. So it's a husband and wife, right? Well, I guess if they're husband and wife, they're 50-50 owners regardless. But the husband, guys have heart attacks more often, so I'll say the husband's the operating is the operating principal, has a debilitating heart attack, what have you, right? Are there exceptions made? Are there provisions for, okay, we're going to let this spouse out of the agreement?
There are, and most good franchisors will build that into the contract. A special force majeure provision is the technical term for it, which means an event that was unforeseen at the outset occurs and allows a franchisee to terminate early or to transition the business to a third party. And those sort of circumstances, a medical issue, a disability, those are sort of things that should be in the agreement to provide that flexibility.
Thanks. Yep. I know we're getting to the point where we need to wrap up, but I really do want to go back to what I said we're going to go back to, which is something that I've seen be very important, at least in any kind of franchise business where a retail space is necessary, right? Or any kind of office space. Lease negotiation. My big question for you on that is, what are the things that people miss that you help them, and this franchise or not, right? So just somebody who is about to sign their first lease.
Yep.
What are the things that you help people catch that justify what you charge for that reviewing of a lease agreement?
Right. Not unlike the franchise agreement itself, a lease agreement is a significant commitment for a business. They tend to be, a minimum of a 5-year term on a lease, typically a commercial lease. Typically you're paying by the square foot. You need to be evaluating things like, do I have a right to expand? If I need additional space, I've built a brand at a particular location. If I need additional space, do I have a right to expand?
And that happens a lot.
It does.
Yeah.
And do I have the ability to extend the term of my lease? I initially signed a 5-year lease. Things are going great. I want to stay at this location. I built up clientele here, but I need the ability to renew my lease. So if you built that into the initial lease, or a renewal right at a reasonable rental rate. I mean, those are important things to look at. Again, the personal guarantee arises. Most commercial leases will require a personal guarantee from the owner. So there's another commitment that the owner needs to be aware of and make sure that they're willing to accept that.
Right. Understand what that means to them and their family.
Exactly.
Gotcha.
Yep.
Dave, we're gonna have to do another episode.
Let's do it
because this has been fun. This has been very good, very specific, helpful information that I think is applicable to anybody investing in a franchise, and in many cases, like that lease discussion, applicable to anybody that wants to be an entrepreneur. Period. So thank you so much for spending time with us today. How could folks get a hold of you?
They can contact us at our office. We're in the Regency area. Our website is fitzgeraldshore.com. It's probably the best way to contact us. Be glad to sit down and talk with prospective franchisees. A no charge initial meeting if they just want to chat and kind of figure out what services we provide and whether or not we can help them. So
fantastic.
Would really enjoy that.
Thank you, and thanks again for being here today.
You're welcome. Thank you.
You bet. Speaking of getting in touch, if you're not a spelling bee champion and you can't spell Fitzgerald Shore, just scan the QR code on your screen, and that'll get you the contact info for us, and we'll get you in touch with them. Speaking of the QR code, use that puppy, okay? Scan it and go ahead and subscribe, follow, and share our episodes and your favorite episodes. Give us feedback on what you like about the podcast. This is your podcast. Thank you all for joining us once again. Another thank you to Dave Hohman. We very much appreciate your time with us today, sharing about franchise law. We will see all of you again here soon on another episode of the Heartland Franchise Guy.